The photograph was never supposed to be found. It had been sitting inside a sealed evidence box for decades. No one knew why the box had survived. No one knew who had placed it there. And no one could explain the man standing at the end of the platform. The photograph was taken in 1967. The location was Dalmorn Station, a small railway station somewhere in northern Europe. The station had been closed for years. The tracks were still there. The platform was still there. But according to every surviving record, nobody was supposed to have been standing there that night. The photograph itself looked ordinary at first. An old train, a wet platform, a single overhead lamp, fog hanging between the tracks. Then, there was the man. He stood several meters away from the photographer. He wore a long, dark coat. His hands were at his sides. His face was turned directly toward the camera. But something about him was wrong. Not frightening, not obviously impossible, just wrong. The photograph was examined again, then again. The investigators checked the original negative. They checked the date, they checked the station records, they checked the train schedule. Everything matched, except the man. There was no passenger list containing him. There was no railway employee matching his description. There was no witness statement mentioning him. And there was no record that anyone had been on that platform when the photograph was taken. The strange part was not that nobody remembered the man. The strange part was that nobody remembered taking the photograph. The photographer was identified as a railway employee named Elias Venn. His camera was found in his home after his death. The photograph came from that camera, but Venn had never mentioned the picture, not once. Then investigators noticed something in the background, a small station clock. Its hands appeared to show 3:17. At first, that seemed meaningless. Then they examined another photograph from the same roll. The clock showed 3:17 again. The train was in a different position. The weather was different. But the clock had not moved. Investigators assumed the clock was broken. That should have ended the mystery. It did not. Because the clock was not broken. It had been removed from the station 2 years before the photograph was taken. And yet it appeared clearly in the image, still showing 3:17. The investigators returned to the photograph. They enlarged the man's face. The image became distorted. But one detail remained clear. He was looking directly at the camera, and beneath the photograph, written in faded pencil, were 4 words. Words that had not been written by Elias Venn. Do not develop the rest. There were 12 more frames on the roll. Only one had ever been printed. The other negatives were still missing. And that was when the black file was opened again. Because the photograph did not show a man who had disappeared. It showed a man who, according to the evidence, had never existed. And someone had known that long before the investigators did. The first rule of an investigation like this is simple. If someone appears in a photograph, there should be something else. A name, a document, a witness, a ticket, a uniform, something. The investigators had none of it. They began with the station. Dalmorn had once been a small but active railway stop. Passenger trains passed through every day. Workers maintained the tracks. Tickets were issued. Timetables were recorded. And every employee had been documented. The investigators searched the surviving railway archives. Nothing. No unidentified employee. No missing passenger. No report of a stranger being seen at the station. They searched newspapers from the week of the photograph. Nothing. They searched local police records. Nothing. They searched death records. Nothing. Then they found something unexpected. The train visible in the photograph was real. It was the 2:56 evening service to Vere. The locomotive number was visible beneath the fog. The train had arrived at Dalmorn at 3:12. It departed 6 minutes later. That meant the photograph had almost certainly been taken between 3:12 and 3:18. The clock showing 3:17 suddenly mattered. At 3:17, according to the timetable, the train was still at the platform. But there was another problem. The photographer, Elias Venn, was not scheduled to be there. His shift had ended at 2:40. His supervisor confirmed it. Venn should have been home. Instead, somehow, he had walked back to the station. Nobody knew why. The investigators then found his personal notebook. Most of it contained ordinary railway notes, numbers, maintenance details, names of colleagues, small observations about delays. Then, 3 pages before the date of the photograph, there was a sentence. Only one sentence. I saw him again. There was no name, no description, nothing else. The next page had been torn out. The investigators searched the notebook for earlier references. There were 4. Each one was written months apart. I saw him again. Same coat, same place. Still watching. The final note was dated the day before the photograph. This time, Ven had written something different. He is closer now. That changed the investigation. The photograph was no longer the beginning. It was the end of something. Ven had apparently seen the man before. But where? The answer appeared in an old railway archive. A photograph from 1964. 3 years before the final photograph, it showed Dalmorn Station during a winter inspection. The investigators almost missed him. He was barely visible in the background. A dark figure near the far end of the platform. Long coat, hat, hands at his sides, face turned toward the camera. The same man. The image was compared with the 1967 photograph. The investigators marked the man's position, then his height, then the shape of his shoulders, then the coat. Everything matched. 3 years apart. Different weather, different trains, different photographers. The same man. Then came the detail that made the case stranger. The 1964 photograph had been taken at 3:17. The investigators checked the original station clock. It was visible above the platform. 3:17. They checked another photograph from 1965. The man appeared again. Same position, same clothing, same time. 3:17. By now, the investigation had changed completely. They were no longer asking who the man was. They were asking how long he had been appearing. The archive contained hundreds of photographs from Dalmorn. Most were ordinary. But once investigators knew what to look for, they began finding him. A reflection in a carriage window. A distant figure beside the signal box. A shadow near the end of the platform. Always near the same place. Always at 3:17. And then they found something that should have been impossible. A photograph from 1951. 16 years before the final photograph. The man was there. Same coat. Same posture. Same face. But this photograph contained one more detail. Someone had written a note on the back. Not in 1951. The handwriting had been added decades later. It said, "He was already there when we arrived," and beneath it was a name. Elias Ven. The man had been photographed long before Ven ever worked at Dalmorn, which meant Ven had not discovered him. He had inherited the mystery, and perhaps that was why, on the final night, he returned to the station, not to photograph the man, but to find out why the man had been waiting for him. The investigators had 1 photograph. Then they found 6 more. That should have made the case easier. Instead, it made the photograph impossible. Every image showed the same man. Different years, different cameras, different photographers, different weather, but the same face, the same coat, the same position, and always the same time. 3:17. The investigators decided to examine the original negative from 1967. Not a scan, not a printed photograph, the actual negative. It had been stored separately from the evidence box. For years, nobody had touched it. Under normal magnification, there was nothing unusual. Then the image was digitally enhanced. The first discovery was the man's face. There was a small mark beneath his left eye. It looked like a scar. Investigators compared it with the earlier photographs. The mark was present in every image. Even the 1951 photograph contained it. But the man himself appeared to have the face of someone much younger. He did not seem to age. Then they enhanced the area behind him. Something appeared in the fog, a second figure, barely visible, standing several meters behind the man. The investigators assumed it was another passenger. They increased the contrast. The figure became clearer. It was not a passenger. It was Elias Ven. But that was impossible. The photograph had been taken by Ven himself. He could not have been standing behind the man, unless someone else had taken the photograph. They checked the camera. The shutter mechanism had been manually triggered. The position of the camera suggested it had been placed on a tripod. But no tripod appeared in the original evidence inventory. Then they found a second exposure. The frame immediately before the final photograph. It showed the empty platform. No man, no Ven, no second figure, just the train. The next frame showed the man, and behind him, Ven. The investigators slowed the sequence down. There was no explanation for how Ven could appear in front of his own camera. Then another detail appeared. The man was holding something, a small rectangular object. At first, it looked like a notebook. The enhancement revealed a photograph. He was holding a photograph of the same platform. And in that photograph was the man. The investigators were looking at a photograph containing another photograph containing the same man. They enlarged the inner image. It showed the platform again, the same clock, 3:17, and standing in the distance was the same figure. The image appeared to continue forever. A photograph inside another photograph. Each one contained the same man. Then they noticed something different. In the deepest visible photograph, the man was no longer standing at the end of the platform. He was standing much closer, almost directly in front of the camera. The investigators stopped the enhancement. Nobody wanted to continue, but one technician did. He isolated the man's face. The pixels shifted, the image sharpened, and for the first time, his expression became visible. He was not looking at the camera, he was looking past it, at something behind the photographer. The technician turned around. There was nothing there. When he looked back at the screen, the expression had changed. The man was now looking directly into the camera. Then a second line of writing appeared beneath the photograph. It had been invisible on the original print. Only after enhancement could it be read. 4 words. You found me again. The investigation team checked the handwriting. It did not belong to Venn. It did not belong to any known investigator. But it matched the handwriting on the earlier warning. Do not develop the rest. There was now only one question. Who had written both messages? The answer came from an unexpected place. The back of the original negative contained a faint serial number. The number belonged to a batch of photographic plates manufactured in 1949. That meant the negative stock itself was older than the photograph. Much older. The investigators checked the manufacturer. The company had gone bankrupt in 1950. No plates from that batch were supposed to remain in circulation after 1952. Yet the final photograph had been captured on one. Then they found the inventory record. One box of those plates had been purchased by Dalmorn Station in 1949. The purchaser's name was listed, Elias Venn. But Venn was born in 1938. He would have been 11 years old, and according to his family records, he had never worked at the station until 1962. Someone had used his name 11 years before he could have signed the document. The investigators now had a new possibility. Maybe the man in the photograph was not following Venn. Maybe he had been waiting for him. For years, decades, possibly longer. And the final photograph was not evidence of where the man had been. It was evidence of where he was going. Closer. The investigators now had a name, but it was not the man's name. It belonged to someone else. Someone who had supposedly died 5 years before the final photograph was taken. The clue came from the enhanced image. The small object in the man's hand was not a notebook. It was a railway identification card. The photograph on the card was almost impossible to see. But the name beneath it was clear. Adrian Vale. The investigators searched the railway archives. There was an Adrian Vale. He had worked for the Northern Railway Service. His position was listed as signal technician. His employment began in 1939. His records ended in 1962. The reason was simple. Adrian Vale had died. At least, that was what the records said. The official death certificate gave the date as November 14, 1962. Cause of death was listed as accidental drowning. His body had supposedly been recovered from a river several kilometers from Dalmorn. The investigators requested the original report. There was a problem. There was no body photograph, no autopsy report, no personal belongings list, no funeral record, only a death certificate, and one signature. The signature belonged to a railway official named Elias Venn, the same Elias Venn who would later photograph the mysterious man. That discovery changed everything. Venn had signed the death certificate of Adrian Vale. Then, 5 years later, he photographed a man carrying Vale's identification card. The investigators searched deeper. They found a personnel photograph of Vale from 1958. It was taken inside the Railway Administration building. The photograph showed a thin man in a railway uniform, dark hair, sharp features, a small scar beneath the left eye. The same scar. The investigators placed Vale's photograph beside the final photograph. The resemblance was exact. The man standing on the platform appeared to be Adrian Vale, a man who had officially died in 1962, but the case became stranger when they compared the dates. The 1964 photograph showed the mysterious man 2 years after Vale's death. The 1965 photograph showed him again. Then the 1967 photograph. Always the same face. Always the same coat. Always 317. The investigators contacted the family. Vale had one surviving relative, his younger sister, Margaret. She was 87 years old. When shown the photograph, she stared at it for several seconds. Then she asked one question. "Where did you get this?" The investigator told her about Dalmorn Station. Margaret became silent. She finally said something that was not in any official record. Adrian had warned her about the station. Not once. Many times. He believed something happened there every night at 3:17. Margaret said her brother had become obsessed with the time. He would wake suddenly during the night. He would write the same number on pieces of paper, 3:17. Then he would burn them. She remembered one night in particular. 3 days before his supposed death. Adrian came to her house carrying a camera. He told her to hide it. She asked why. He said he had photographed someone who had been standing at Dalmorn Station. Someone who had been there before him. Margaret asked who. Adrian answered, "Me." She thought he was joking. He was not. He told her the man in the photograph looked exactly like him. Same face, same scar, same coat. But there was one difference. The man appeared older in one photograph, then younger in another. Margaret never understood what he meant, until the investigators showed her the 1951 photograph. She began to cry. Not because she recognized Adrian, because she recognized the coat. She said their father had owned it. He had disappeared in 1951, the same year the first photograph was taken. The investigators asked what happened to him. Margaret said nobody knew. Her father had left home one evening and never returned. The family assumed he had abandoned them, but Adrian had always believed something else. He believed their father had gone to Dalmorn, and that he had never truly left. The investigators returned to the railway archive. They searched every photograph connected to the station. They found a pattern. 1951. The man appeared. 1962. Adrian disappeared. 1964. The man appeared again. 1967. Venn took the final photograph. And beneath the photograph was another handwritten message. This time, it contained a name. Not Adrian Vale, not Elias Venn. It said, "The next one is you." The investigators initially believed the message was meant for Venn, but Venn had been dead for decades, so they checked the original case file. Someone had added the message after Venn's death. The handwriting was fresh, and beside it was a date, not 1967, not 1970, not even the year the investigation began. It was dated only 3 weeks before the investigators opened the black file. The man had not simply survived the photograph. Someone had been adding evidence to the file decades later, which meant the mystery was still active, and someone knew exactly who would find it. The investigators had spent 3 days studying the photograph. Then they found the second camera. It was hidden beneath the floorboards of the old railway office. The discovery happened almost by accident. One of the investigators noticed that several boards near the wall had been replaced. The wood looked newer than the rest. They lifted it. Beneath it was a metal case. Inside was a camera, an old mechanical camera. No film, no label, no fingerprints. But there was something else. A strip of paper wrapped around the camera. 3 words were written on it. "Do not use." The investigators should have stopped there. They did not. They examined the camera. The mechanism still worked. The shutter still moved. And inside the camera was a roll of film. A roll that had never been developed. The film was removed carefully. The laboratory processed it. There were 12 exposures. The first showed Dalmorn Station, empty. The second showed the platform, empty. The third showed the station clock, 3:17. The fourth showed the railway tracks, still empty. Then came the fifth. The man appeared. He stood at the far end of the platform, exactly as he appeared in the final photograph. The investigators compared the 2 images. They were nearly identical, but there was one difference. In the second camera's photograph, the man was closer, only by a few meters. The 6th photograph showed him closer again. The 7th closer. The 8th closer. By the 9th photograph, he was standing halfway down the platform. By the 10th, he was near the camera. The 11th photograph showed only his upper body. The 12th showed his face. Full frame. No fog. No distortion. Just the face. The investigators stopped the sequence there because the man was smiling. Not a normal smile, a small expression, almost as if he knew the photographs were being watched. They enlarged the final frame. There was something reflected in his eyes. A room. A desk. A person sitting behind the camera. The investigators recognized the room. It was the Blackfile archive. The photograph had been taken at Dalmorn, but the reflection showed the archive room where the photograph was being examined decades later. That should have been impossible. The film had supposedly been exposed in 1967, yet the reflection showed the exact room where the investigators were sitting. They checked the archive. There was a security camera above the door. The footage from the previous night was reviewed. At 3:17 in the morning, the archive lights turned on. Nobody entered. The lights remained on for exactly 17 seconds. Then they turned off. The investigators checked the room. Nothing had moved, except one thing. The original photograph had been placed face down. Nobody admitted touching it. They turned it over. A new mark was visible on the back. A fingerprint. Fresh ink. The print was compared with the known fingerprints from Adrian Vale. It matched. But Adrian Vale had supposedly died 5 years before the final photograph. The investigators now faced a problem. If the fingerprint was genuine, then one of two things had happened. Someone had forged it, or Adrian Vale had never died. They reopened the death investigation. The river where Vale's body was supposedly recovered was searched again. Divers found nothing. The original death report was examined. One line had been altered. The body had never been positively identified. The identification had been made from clothing, a dark railway coat, a watch, and a ring. There was no face, no dental record, no photograph. The investigators searched the evidence inventory. The ring was missing. The watch was missing. The coat was missing. Everything used to identify Adrian Vale had disappeared. Except one item, a small railway key. It had been stored in the evidence room for 64 years. The key was stamped with a number, 317. The investigators tried it on the old station doors. It opened one, a door that should not have existed. Behind it was a narrow corridor. No windows, no lights. At the end was another door, and on that door was a faded metal plate. The letters were almost gone, but they could still be read. V. The investigators opened it. Inside was a small room, a chair, a table, an old camera, and on the wall were dozens of photographs. Every photograph showed the same man, but the photographs were not arranged by year. They were arranged by distance. The first showed him far away. The final one showed him standing directly in front of the camera. There were dozens of empty spaces between them, as if someone had removed photographs from the sequence. The investigators counted the remaining images. There were 47. Then they noticed the newest photograph. It had no date. It showed the archive room. The investigators were standing inside it. The photograph had been taken from behind them, and in the corner of the image, reflected in the glass, stood the man. He was watching them. The photograph was still warm, as if it had been printed moments earlier. Nobody touched the photograph. For several minutes, the investigators simply stared at it. The newest image showed the archive room from behind. Every person in the room was visible, every desk, every cabinet, every light, and in the reflection near the glass door stood the man. The investigators checked the security footage again. At the exact time the photograph appeared, the cameras had recorded nothing unusual. No person entered, no printer operated, no door opened. But the photograph existed. That was enough to force a new question. If someone was producing these photographs now, where were they doing it? The investigators returned to the hidden room. The walls were covered with photographs. 47 remained, but there were marks where others had been removed. They counted the empty spaces. 31. 78 photographs should have existed. Only 47 remained. Then they noticed the order. The photographs were not simply getting closer, they were moving through time. The first image showed the man in 1951. The next showed him in 1958. Then 1962. Then 1964. Then 1965. Then 1967. After that, the dates became strange. 1974. 1975. 1976. 1977. 1978. The man was still there. Same face. Same coat. Same scar. Same expression. He had not aged. But something else had changed. His distance from the camera. With every photograph, he moved closer. The investigators laid the images across the floor. The sequence formed a timeline. The man was slowly approaching. Then they reached the newest photograph. It had been taken inside the black file archive. The date was yesterday. The man was only a few meters away. The investigators looked at each other. The next empty space on the wall was directly beside it. There should have been another photograph, but it was missing. They searched the room. Nothing. Then one investigator noticed something beneath the table. A small envelope. His name was written on it. He opened it. Inside was a single negative. No photograph. Just the negative. He held it against the light. The image was dark. At first, there was nothing. Then the shape of a room appeared. It was the archive. The same room. The same desks. But the perspective was different. The camera was inside the room, looking toward the investigators. And the man was standing behind them. The investigator dropped the negative. Nobody spoke. They developed it. The result was even worse. The photograph showed the exact moment they had been examining the negative. The image had somehow captured the future, or the present. The distinction no longer mattered. Then they found a date printed along the edge. Tomorrow. Not a year, not a month, just one word. Tomorrow. The investigators began checking every known photograph for the same anomaly. They found it in the 1967 image. A tiny reflection in the train window. A clock. 3:17. But this clock showed a date. The date was 24 hours after the photograph had supposedly been taken. That meant the photograph contained information from the future. The investigators now had two possibilities. Either someone had manipulated every photograph, or the photographs were not recording events. They were predicting them. That possibility connected episode 4 to the earlier black file cases. The signal, the witness, the room. Each case had contained something that appeared before it happened. A warning, a memory, a location. Now the photograph was doing the same thing. It was not showing the man as he was. It was showing where he would be, and where he would be next. The investigators returned to the final photograph. They enlarged the background. There was a small object on the station wall, a timetable. Most of the text was unreadable, but one destination could be identified: Dalmorn. The train was not leaving Dalmorn, it was arriving there. At 3:17, the investigators checked the current railway network. Dalmorn station no longer operated. The tracks had been removed decades earlier. There could be no train. Yet the timetable in the photograph showed a service scheduled for the following morning. The investigators searched the railway database. No such train existed. Then one of them noticed the destination code. It was not a modern railway code. It belonged to the old Northern Railway Service. The same organization that employed Adrian Vale. The same organization that recorded his death. The same organization that had purchased the photographic plates in 1949. The entire mystery suddenly pointed backward, not forward. The man was not appearing because someone was photographing him. Someone was photographing him because he was appearing, and every photograph seemed to move him closer to the present. The final missing frame became the most important piece of evidence, because if the sequence was correct, the next photograph should show the man closer than ever. The investigators searched the hidden room again. Nothing. Then they heard a sound from the corridor. 3 slow knocks. They froze. Another 3 knocks. Then one final knock. 3.45. The old railway clock outside the room began moving. For the first time in decades, its hands changed. They stopped at 3:17, and somewhere inside the station, a camera shutter clicked. Once. The shutter clicked once. Nobody moved. Then it clicked again. The investigators slowly turned toward the corridor. There was no camera there, only darkness. They switched on their lights and walked toward the sound. At the end of the corridor was the old station platform. The fog had returned. It was almost identical to the photograph. The same empty tracks. The same broken lamp. The same clock. 3:17. Then they saw the camera. It was sitting on a wooden bench. An old mechanical camera. The same model used by Elias Venn. Nobody had brought it there. The investigator closest to it reached for the camera. A strip of photographic paper was sticking out of the back. It was still developing. They waited. Slowly, an image appeared. The platform. The investigators were standing beside the camera, but someone else was standing behind them. The man. He was much closer now, only a few meters away. The investigator turned around. Nothing. He looked back at the photograph. The man was still there. Then another detail appeared. The man was not looking at them. He was looking at the camera, as if the camera itself was the thing he had been waiting for. The investigators took the photograph back to the archive. They compared it with the earlier images. Something was wrong. The man's position had changed, but his face had not. His body was moving closer. His face remained identical. The investigators examined the photograph at extreme magnification. They discovered something beneath the image, a second exposure, hidden under the first. It showed a room. A railway office. On the desk was a file. The words on the cover were clear. Black file. The investigators stared at each other. The photograph was showing them the file, but the file was already in front of them. They opened it. Inside were reports from every previous black file case. The signal. The witness. The room. All of them were connected by one detail. 317. The investigators had missed it. The signal from the first case had been recorded at 317. The witness from the second case remembered events beginning at 317. The room in the third case contained a clock stopped at 317. Now the photograph contained the same time. The cases were not separate. They were pieces of the same sequence. The investigators searched the oldest pages. At the bottom of one report was a handwritten note. Do not investigate the photographs. The note was signed by someone named A. Vale. But Adrian Vale had never been listed as an investigator. He had been a signal technician. Why would he have access to the black file? They searched his employment records. His official position changed in 1962. For exactly 11 months, his job title was removed. There was no explanation. Then it returned, signal technician, but the investigators found a hidden payroll code, BF Black File. Adrian Vale had apparently worked for the organization behind the cases. Not as an investigator, as a witness. That explained why he knew about the photographs. It explained why he knew about 317. But it did not explain why he appeared in photographs taken after his death. Then the investigators found his final report. It was only one page. The first sentence was ordinary. The man is not the subject. The second sentence was stranger. The photograph is. Then came the line that changed the case. The photograph does not record the man. It records the person who is looking. The investigators read it again. The man in the photograph was not being photographed. The person viewing the photograph was. Every time someone looked at the image, the photograph changed, not visibly, not immediately. But somewhere inside the image, a new frame was being created, a future position, a new location, a new observer. The man was moving toward whoever was looking. They tested the theory. One investigator looked at the photograph. Nothing happened. Another looked. Nothing. Then they photographed the image. The new photograph showed something different. The man had moved. Closer. The investigators checked the original. It had not changed. The copy had. The photograph was not reproducing itself. It was advancing. One frame at a time. The investigators placed the copy beside the original. The man's position had moved several meters. Then they made another copy. He moved again. Closer. Again. Closer. They stopped. Nobody wanted to know what happened if the process continued. Then the printer produced one final image without being asked. The image showed the archive room. The investigators were standing around the table, but there was one empty chair, and sitting in that chair was the man. His face was no longer hidden. It was perfectly clear. It was Adrian Vale, but the investigators knew that face. They had seen it in the 1958 personnel photograph. They had seen it in the 1964 photograph. They had seen it in the 1967 photograph. Now they were seeing it in 2026. The man looked directly at the camera, and beneath him was a handwritten sentence. The final photograph has not been taken yet. The investigators looked at the empty chair, then at the camera. And for the first time, they understood the title of the case. The final photograph was not the last photograph of the man. It was the last photograph of someone else. The investigators did not leave the archive. They stayed until morning. Nobody wanted to be alone. Nobody wanted to look at the photographs again. But just before dawn, one investigator noticed something missing. The original photograph was gone. The frame was still on the table. The glass was still there. But the photograph had disappeared. In its place was a new image. No one had printed it. No one had placed it there. It showed Dalmorn Station. But the station was different. The platform was clean, the lights were working, a train stood beside the tracks, and above the platform was the old clock, 3:17. The investigators recognized the train. It was the same train from the 1967 photograph, but the date on the timetable was current, August 13th, 2026. Tomorrow. They checked the railway network. There was no scheduled service. Dalmorn Station had no active tracks. The timetable was impossible. Then the image changed. Not in front of their eyes. The photograph simply became different when they looked again. The train doors were now open. Someone stood inside. The man. Adrian Vale. He was looking toward the camera. The investigators searched the black file archives for any reference to a train arriving at 3:17. They found one. It was buried inside a report from 1974. A railway employee had reported hearing a train at Dalmorn after the tracks had been removed. He described the sound as unusually close. He said he heard brakes, then doors opening, then footsteps. 3 minutes later, everything stopped. His report was dismissed. But at the bottom was a handwritten note. Do not board. The investigators found another report. 1981. Same sound, same time. 3:17. Another in 1993. Another in 2004. Another in 2017. Every report described the same thing. A train that should not exist. A platform that should not be active. And footsteps. Always footsteps. The investigators began to understand. The photographs were not simply documenting the man. They were documenting the arrival. The man was not walking toward the camera. He was walking toward the train, and the train was moving toward the present. Then they discovered something inside the newest photograph. A passenger list. It contained only one name, Adrian Vale. The investigators checked the date. Tomorrow, August 13th, 2026. Destination unknown. The room became silent. One investigator suggested destroying the photograph. Another refused. They argued for several minutes. Then the lights went out. The emergency lights came on. The photograph was still on the table, but now there was someone else standing beside Vale in the image. A woman. The investigators did not recognize her. Then one of them noticed the clothing. The woman was wearing the same coat as one of the investigators. The room went silent again. The investigator looked down. She was wearing the same coat. Nobody spoke. The photograph had predicted her. Or perhaps it had recorded something that had not happened yet. She stepped away from the table. The photograph changed. The woman in the image moved closer to the train. The investigator moved away. The image changed again. The woman disappeared. For a moment, everyone believed the danger had passed. Then another photograph appeared. It showed the investigator standing on the platform, alone. The train behind her, Adrian Vale beside the open door, and the mysterious man standing several meters away. There was no way to know whether the photograph showed the past or the future. Then they saw the clock. 3:17. The investigator looked at the clock on the archive wall. It showed 3:16. 1 minute remained. Nobody moved. The second hand reached the top. 3:17. Every light in the building went out. A train whistle sounded outside. The investigators ran to the window. There were no tracks. There was no train. But the sound was real. Then came the footsteps. 1, 2, 3. They stopped outside the archive door. The door slowly opened. Nobody was standing there, but something had been left on the floor. A photograph. The investigators picked it up. It showed the archive room. The same people, the same table. But there was one difference. The photograph had been taken from inside the room, behind the investigators, and in the background stood Adrian Vale. He was no longer at the railway station. He was standing inside the black file archive. The investigators turned. Nothing. They looked at the photograph again. Vale was closer, then closer again. Each time they looked away and back, he appeared nearer. Finally, his face filled most of the image. And beneath it was a final message. One of you has already been there. The investigators looked at each other. Nobody understood. Then one of them noticed something on the desk. A personnel photograph. It showed the investigators standing outside Dalmorn Station. But the photograph was dated 1951, and in the corner stood one of them. Same face, same coat, same eyes. The impossible conclusion was becoming unavoidable. The man in the final photograph was not coming from the past. He was coming from somewhere else. and one of the investigators had been there before. The photograph from 1951 changed the investigation completely. One of the investigators appeared in it, the same face, the same eyes, the same expression. But the person in the photograph was wearing a railway uniform from another era. There was no possible explanation. The investigator was not even alive in 1951, at least according to the records. They checked the photograph again. Then they noticed something in the man's hand. A camera. The same camera found beneath the floorboards. The investigator was holding it. That raised the most important question in the entire case. Who had taken the first photograph? If the camera belonged to the investigator in 1951, then Elias Venn could not have been the original photographer. Perhaps Venn had only inherited the camera. Perhaps everyone who touched it became part of the sequence. The investigators searched the camera for markings. Inside the casing was a tiny inscription. Not a serial number, a name. Adrian Vale. The camera had belonged to Vale. That meant Vale had possessed the camera before his supposed death. But there was another problem. The camera found beneath the station was not the same camera. It was an identical model. The investigators compared the mechanisms. The serial numbers were different. Two cameras, both associated with Vale, both connected to the photographs. They searched his old apartment. The building had been demolished decades earlier. But the property records revealed something strange. Vale had rented 2 rooms, one official, one unregistered. The unregistered room was never mentioned in his personnel records. The investigators found the address. It led them to a building still standing. Inside was an abandoned storage room. Behind a false wall, they found boxes, photographic plates, railway documents, newspapers, and dozens of photographs. The earliest was dated 1949. The latest was dated 2026. Every image showed Dalmorn Station. Every image contained the man. But now the investigators saw something they had never noticed before. The man was not always alone. In almost every photograph, someone stood near him. Different people, different years, different clothing, but the same pattern. The person nearest the man eventually disappeared from the historical record. 1951. A railway worker disappeared. 1958. A journalist disappeared. 1962. Adrian Vale disappeared. 1967. Elias Venn died. 1974. A station inspector vanished. 1981. A photographer disappeared. 1993. A researcher disappeared. 2004. A railway historian vanished. 2017. A black file investigator disappeared. The investigators checked the files. Every missing person had examined the photographs. Every one. The man was not killing people. He was removing them from the record. That explained the missing reports, the missing names, the missing photographs, the empty spaces. But it still did not explain why. Then they found Vale's final notebook. Only one page remained. It contained a diagram, a circle. Inside the circle was the number 317. Around it were 8 names. The first 7 had been crossed out. The 8th was blank. Under the diagram, Vale had written, "The sequence ends when the final observer becomes the subject." The investigators stared at the blank space. Then they understood. The black file was not documenting 8 separate mysteries. It was documenting a sequence, 8 cases, 8 stages. And the final stage was happening now. Episode 4 was not simply about the man in the photograph. It was about the person who would become the final photograph. They checked the list. The first 7 names corresponded to people connected to the earlier black file cases. The 8th name had not been written, because the 8th person had not yet been chosen, or perhaps had not yet realized they had been chosen. Then the camera on the table clicked. Everyone froze. A photograph slowly emerged. It showed the room. The investigators were standing exactly where they were now, but the image contained something impossible. One person was missing. The investigators counted themselves. There were 4 people in the room. The photograph showed 3. The missing person was standing somewhere else. They turned toward the door. Nothing. Then the missing investigator's voice came from the corridor. "Don't open it." Everyone froze. The voice continued, "Whatever you see, don't open the door." The investigator was standing outside, but they could hear their own voice. The person inside the room looked at the others. The others looked back. Then the photograph on the table changed. The missing investigator appeared in the image. Standing beside Adrian Vale, the man had one hand on their shoulder, and the investigator was smiling. Not because they were happy, because they appeared not to know they were being photographed. The photograph was dated tomorrow, August 13th, 2026, at 3:17, the same time, the same station, the same train. Then the investigator inside the room received a phone call. The caller ID displayed one name, Elias Venn, a man who had been dead for decades. The phone rang again, and again. Nobody wanted to answer. Finally, the investigator did. There was silence. Then a voice whispered, "You are looking at the wrong man." The call ended. The investigator looked at the photograph. For the first time, they noticed the truth. The mysterious man was not standing behind Adrian Vale. He was standing behind the camera, and in every photograph, the camera was pointing at the viewer. The man had never been the subject. The observer was. Then the final photograph appeared. It showed the investigator holding the camera, standing at Dalmorn Station. Behind them was Adrian Vale, and behind Vale was the man. But behind the man was another figure, someone the investigators had never seen before, someone holding another camera. And that figure was looking directly at them. The photograph had no date, only one word, begin. The word was simple, begin, but it was written on the final photograph, not end, not finished, begin. The investigators understood what that meant. The photograph was not the conclusion. It was the beginning of the next stage. They returned to the hidden room beneath Dalmorn Station. The walls were still covered with photographs. 47 remained, but now they understood what the empty spaces represented. People, observers, investigators. Everyone who had tried to understand the man had eventually become part of the evidence. They placed the final photograph beside the others. For the first time, the sequence was complete. 1951, 1952, 1953, 1954, 1955, 1956, 1957, 1958, 1959, 1960, 1961, 1962. The man appeared in every period, but he had never aged. The investigators compared the earliest image with the newest. His face was identical. Then they compared the people around him. They changed. They disappeared. They died. They were forgotten. The man remained. That was the answer to one mystery. But it created another. Who was Adrian Vale? The investigators returned to his death certificate. They compared the signature with his known handwriting. It was not his. The signature had been forged. The body found in 1962 had never been identified. The coat belonged to Vale. The ring belonged to Vale. The watch belonged to Vale. But the man inside the coat was never confirmed. Adrian Vale had never officially died. His disappearance had been manufactured, and someone had wanted the world to believe it. The investigators searched one final archive, a restricted railway document dated 1949. The title was simple, Project 317. The document described an experiment involving photography, time, and human observation. Most of the pages were missing, but one paragraph remained. The experiment had begun after railway workers reported seeing the same person in photographs taken years apart. The researchers believed the camera was not recording time, it was recording observers. The more a person studied the image, the more connected they became to it. Eventually, the observer would appear inside the photograph, and another observer would take their place. A chain. No beginning, no ending, only replacement. The man in the photograph was the constant. Everyone else was temporary. That was why the same face appeared for 75 years. He was not moving through time. Time was moving around him. The investigators finally understood the title. The man in the final photograph was not the man who would appear last. He was the man who remained after everyone else disappeared. Then they found one final document. A handwritten note from Adrian Vale. It contained only 3 sentences. I tried to destroy the photographs. They always returned. If you are reading this, he has already seen you. The investigators looked at the newest photograph. The man was no longer standing at Dalmorn Station. He was standing in the black file archive, behind the investigators. Closer than before. They turned around. Nothing. They looked back. The photograph had changed. The man was gone. For the first time in 75 years, the photograph showed an empty room. The investigators believed it was over. Then one of them noticed something in the corner. A camera, sitting on the desk. Its lens pointed directly at them. The camera had not been there before. They checked the room. No one had entered. No one had left. The camera was loaded with film. One investigator picked it up. There was a photograph inside the case. They removed it. It showed Dalmorn Station. The platform was empty. The clock showed 3:17, but there was no man, no train, no fog. Only a figure standing behind the camera. The investigator looked closer. The figure was himself. He was holding the same photograph. The same camera, the same room, the same moment. A photograph inside a photograph, inside another photograph. There was no beginning, and there was no final image. Only the next observer. The investigator slowly turned the photograph over. 4 words were written on the back. They came from inside. The same words that had ended the previous Black File case. Now they finally understood. The cases had never been separate. The Black File had been documenting a single phenomenon. Each case revealed another part of it. The signal, the witness, the room, the photograph, and whatever came next. The investigators sealed the camera inside a new evidence box. They marked it, Black File, Episode 4, Do Not Open. Then they locked the box. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then came a sound from inside. One camera shutter. Click. The investigators stepped away. A second click. Click. Then a third. Click. The box remained sealed, but something was happening inside. They did not open it. They never found out what had been photographed, because when the box was checked the next morning, the camera was gone, the film was gone, and inside the empty box was a single photograph. It showed the investigators standing around the sealed box, but the photograph had been taken from inside the box. In the background stood the man, and this time, he was not looking at the camera. He was looking directly at the viewer, at us. The final note in the Black File reads, "Some photographs preserve the past. Some predict the future, and some are waiting for you to look." The file was closed. The photograph was archived. The station was demolished, and every official record of Dalmorn was eventually removed. But one image survived, the man in the final photograph. Still standing there, still watching, still waiting. And if the Black File is correct, the most disturbing part is not that he appears in photographs from the past. It is that every time someone discovers the photograph, he appears a little closer, and nobody knows what happens when he reaches the camera.